Welcome to the Manufacturing Money Room with host Tolani Lawson. Tolani is an experienced CFO who works with manufacturing businesses to bring clarity to their numbers, especially when cash feels tight and decisions feel heavy. These are the conversations that usually stay behind closed doors. Until now, it's time to step into the Manufacturing Money Room.
Welcome back to this episode of the Manufacturing Money Room. Today, we want to talk about how strong manufacturers turn information into decisions. We've talked about all sorts of decision-making process. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever sat in a leadership meeting and thought, haven't we talked about this before? The late shipments, the inventory issues, the staffing challenge, and the customer complaints, all of the production bottleneck. Everyone in the room understands the problem. Everyone agrees it is important. Everyone wants it fixed. And yet, somehow, a month later, you're having the exact same conversation again. I've seen this happen in manufacturing businesses of every size. And what's interesting is that it usually isn't a knowledge problem. The team knows what's happening and the reports are available. The issues are visible. So, a lot of the things that we've talked about are already getting implemented and they're already in place. So the data exists and the real challenge is something else. The business has become very good at identifying problem, but not as good at turning those observations into decisions. Because information by itself doesn't improve performance. What improves performance is awareness. So even though we've created all of this visibility that we've talked about so far, that doesn't improve performance. What improves performance is what happens next. The decision, the action, the accountability. That's where results come from. And it's one of the biggest differences I see between an average manufacturer and the exceptional ones. So, exceptional manufacturers don't necessarily have better data. They don't necessarily have better dashboards. As we talked about, it's about knowing those key metrics to track. So, it's not necessarily about better dashboards or better reports. What they do have is a disciplined way of turning information into action. They know how to identify what matters and then decide what happens next. We talked about assigning ownership and being able to move forward. Because at the end of the day, businesses don't improve because they know more, they improve because they do something with what they know. So we've talked a lot about knowing more and understanding your business, but this is about what you do when you have the data. And that's what we're talking about today. How strong manufacturers turn information into decisions. Because visibility tells you what happens in your business. Decision making is what determines what happens next. So let's talk about why information alone doesn't create results. One of the misconceptions that I tend to see is that businesses think more information would automatically lead to better decision making. And it sounds reasonable. But then you're piling up all of this reports, thinking if we had more reports, we'd make better decisions. If we had better dashboards, maybe we would have better outcomes. And if we had more data, maybe we'd have fewer problems. But after working with manufacturing businesses for years, I found that the opposite is often the truth. Many leadership teams aren't suffering from a lack of information, they're drowning in it. So, understanding what data points help your business is very important. Think about how much information the average manufacturer has access to today. You have your ERP reports, production reports, inventory, shipping, financial statement, customer scorecards, and supplier metrics, even daily dashboards, weekly dashboards. So the problem for those people isn't information. The problem is knowing what to do with it. Let's talk about one of the patterns that I see over and over again. Is leadership spending an hour discussing a report and walking away without making a single decision? Everyone leaves more informed, but nothing has changed. And that's because that information is not getting turned into action. Let's talk about an example. Imagine your leadership team reviews a report showing that on time delivery has fallen from 96% to 88%. That is useful information by itself, but it doesn't improve delivery performance. The report hasn't solved anything. The report has simply highlighted a reality. Now, leadership has to ask a different set of questions. Why did this happen? What is causing it? And does it require intervention? Then the next steps of questions is who is responsible for addressing it and what happens next. That's where performance improvement begins. It's not when the information is presented, it's when that decision is made. So, one of the simplest framework I use with leadership teams is this. Every report should answer three questions. What happened? Why did this happen? And what are we going to do about it? Most organizations do a reasonable job answering the first question, which is what happened. And then revenue is down, inventory increased, overtime went up, margin slipped. That's a question that you can easily tell from your report. Then the stronger organizations go one step further and ask, why did that happen? What changed? What caused this result? And what's driving the trend? Those are the real important questions. That's basically lifting the hood and saying what's behind those numbers. And then the best side of asking those questions is then going that step further and saying, what are we going to do about it? Because that's where leadership starts. It's not about awareness, it's about action. Awareness is only the first step. And that's one of the biggest differences between being an average manufacturer and being an exceptional manufacturer. Average organizations will collect the information, but strong organizations want to convert that information into decision making. They understand that the reports don't create the results. Just having those conversations or being aware don't create the results. Decisions is what create the results, and that's where we're going next. One of the reasons strong manufacturers make better decisions is not because they have access to different information. It's because they're asking better questions. Over time, I've noticed that these leadership teams tend to think through problems in a very similar way. Whether they're discussing production, inventory, or cash flow, staffing, or quality, they consistently work through four questions. And that's what I love about this framework is that it's very simple. You don't need a complicated degree, a finance degree, or complicated reports. You don't even need consultants sitting in the room to ask these questions. You simply need the discipline to ask these questions every single time information is presented. Let's walk through them. The first one that we mentioned is what changed? This sounds simple, but it's one of the most overlooked questions in businesses because not every number deserves attention and not every fluctuation is going to be meaningful to your business. So it's not every single metric that you want to track as a business owner. You want to focus on what changed and what's different from last week, what's different from last month. Most importantly, what's different from what we expected. For example, imagine you're reviewing your weekly operations dashboard. And let's go back to that on time delivery. Maybe on time delivery has been running at 96% for months now. Then suddenly it dropped down to 89%. That's interesting. Something changed. Or perhaps inventory has been relatively stable. And then over a few weeks, it begins climbing significantly faster than sales. Something changed. So this could be over time doubling. It could be so many different aspects of your individual business. The goal of the first question is not to solve the problem. The goal is to identify where leadership attention is needed and understanding where this fluctuation becomes meaningful. One thing I often tell leadership teams is the most dangerous numbers in a business are rarely the ones that are low. They're the ones that are changing. So if a number remains consistently low, that might not necessarily be the problem. But when you see a big dip or a big rise, it's not just about the dips as well. If you see a big change, it's often the first signal that something deeper is happening within the business. And you want to pay attention to those signals. Now let's talk about the second question. Why did it change? Now we move from observation to understanding. This is where many organizations get stuck because it's very easy to describe symptoms. It's much harder to identify causes. For example, revenue declined, that's a symptom. Inventory increased, that's a symptom. Customer complaints increased, that's a symptom. The real question is why? What changed the underneath results? Let's say overtime increased significantly. One team might stop there. Overtime is up, discussion is over. But you want to go deeper. Was there a labor shortage? Did demand spike unexpectedly? Did machine downtime increase or did production scheduling change? Was there a quality issue that required rework? So you want to keep asking questions until you reach the underlying cause. Because if you solve the symptom without solving the cause, the problem will usually return back within a few weeks or a month or two. This is one of the reasons why leadership teams often feel like they're having the same conversations over and over again. They're discussing symptoms, not causes. So you want to be relentless about the root cause thinking because once you understand the cause, the solution becomes obvious. Now let's talk about the third question. Does it require action? This is one of the most underrated leadership questions because not every issue deserves intervention. One of the easiest ways to create chaos in a business is to react to every piece of information. A metric moves slightly and everyone panics, or a number dips and everyone changes direction. When you see a trend appear, it doesn't mean it's time to panic. It doesn't mean it's time to create three new meetings on the schedule. What you want to do is operate in a different way. You want to understand the difference between noise and signal for your business. So let's say scrap increases for 1 week. That may not require action. But if scrap increases for 6 consecutive weeks, that's a different conversation that you want to start having. Or maybe a customer places an unusually large order. That temporarily impacts production capacity. And that doesn't necessarily mean you need to restructure the entire organization. The goal is not to react faster, the goal is to react appropriately to each situation. And that's a very important distinction. One of the most valuable skills that leaders develop is learning when to act and when to observe, because unnecessary action creates just as many problems as delayed action for a business. So, what you want is discipline, not to overreact, but also do not ignore the meaningful signals. You want to know the difference between both. Now, let's go to the fourth question. This is a very important one. Who owns the next step? This question is the most important question of all because this is where information becomes action. I've sat in so many leadership meetings over the years, and one pattern that shows up again and again is the issue is identified, the cause is discussed, everyone agrees something should be done, then the meeting ends and nothing happens. Why? Because nobody owns the next step. Ownership is where accountability begins. Let's go back to our inventory example, for example. Suppose leadership determines that inventory has increased because purchasing is ordering larger quantities than necessary. Great, we identify the issue, we understand the cause. Now what? Who's reviewing the reorder points? Who is updating the purchasing parameters within the system? And who is responsible for reporting the progress of this action? Who is accountable for the result? If those questions are not answered, the issue will likely appear in the next month's meeting, and the month after that, and the month after that. One of the simplest rules I use is every significant issue should leave the meeting with an owner and a due date, not a department, not a committee, but one person. Because once ownership becomes clear, progress becomes possible for these issues. And that's where you become a strong manufacturer. That's where strong leadership begins. So it does not stop at awareness and it does not stop at visibility. It moves to accountability. So let's bring it all together. The next time you're reviewing a report, discussing a KPI, or working through a business challenge, walk through these 4 questions. What changed? Why did it change? Does it require action? And who owns the next step? That's it. It's simple, practical, and repeatable. And if your leadership team consistently asks these 4 questions, you'll be amazed at how quickly your meetings become more productive and decisions become clearer and progress becomes a lot more consistent. That's going back to information does not create results, good decisions do. You don't want to get into the danger of analysis paralysis. Now, if you've sat in a leadership meeting and walked through those 4 questions, you've probably experienced another challenge. Sometimes the issue is clear and the cause is clear. The action required is clear and yet no decision gets made. That's where many businesses get stuck because they become trapped in waiting for the perfect information. So let's talk about that. You don't want to wait for the perfect information. You want to be able to act within uncertainty. So, as a strong manufacturer, you need to have a relationship with uncertainty and being able to act in uncertainty. You can't always wait for the perfect information. You can't always wait for the perfect set of data to be available. That doesn't mean act recklessly. It means understanding that perfect information rarely exists. So conditions are constantly changing. Customer demand will change, material cost will move, machines will break, lead times will shift. And if you're waiting until every variable is known, you're probably waiting too long. So, one of the most common mistakes is confusing more information with better decisions. So, don't delay. There's no need to ask for another report. There's no need for analysis paralysis or another meeting. So, what you want to do is gather enough information to understand the situation. You want to make a decision better. You want to monitor the outcome and adjust if necessary because you've learned something important. Waiting is also a decision. When you wait for the next report, you've made a decision to wait instead of acting. So, what you want to do is make an actionable decision. Select an ownership, select an accountable person, and do not wait because waiting is one of the most expensive decisions that you can make. One of my favorite leadership principles is this: the cost of a delayed decision is often greater than the cost of an imperfect decision. Once a business learns how to make decisions, something interesting starts to happen. The culture begins to change, problems get surfaced earlier, and people become more proactive. Ownership becomes clearer, and accountability becomes part of how the organization operates. Strong manufacturers don't just create cultures where people wait to be told what to do. They create cultures where people understand what they own. They understand where issues are raised quickly, where decisions happen at the appropriate level, and where follow through is expected. Because ultimately, execution is not about intelligence, it's just about consistency. So, as a strong manufacturer, what you want is discipline. You want to make sure that issues are identified. You want to make decisions, assign ownership, and follow up. Then repeat the process over and over again. Create that momentum because momentum is one of the most powerful competitive advantages the business can have. Once an organization develops a habit of solving problems instead of discussing them, improvements accelerate, and over time, those small improvements compound into something much bigger. One of the biggest differences between struggling manufacturers and strong manufacturers, as I said, is not visibility, it's action. Both often see the same issues, and the difference is what happens next. Strong manufacturers don't allow information to stop awareness. They convert awareness into decisions, and they convert decisions into accountability. Reports don't improve a business, dashboards don't improve a business. People make good businesses, people make good decisions consistently. That's what creates operational strength and financial strength. And ultimately, that's what allows your business to grow without losing control. In our next and final episode of this season, we're going to bring everything together and talk about what financially strong manufacturers do differently. Because after everything we've discussed, from profit leaks to cash flow, systems, visibility, and decision making, there are a handful of patterns that consistently separate strong from everyone else. And that's where we'll finish this journey. I'll see you in the next episode.
Thanks for spending time in the Manufacturing Money Room. If this episode gave you something to think about, let us know. Drop Tolani a voice note or leave a comment or a review. And hey, if you like what you heard, share it with your friends. If you didn't like what you heard, share it with your enemies. You'll find the links in the show notes to connect with Tolani, and if you want to watch the episode on YouTube, that's there as well. Join us next time in the Manufacturing Money Room, where it's all about better numbers, better decisions, better manufacturing.